Corruption in a country affects the economic outcomes of people living in those countries, but measuring corruption can be really hard. Of course, we try and there are measures out there, but do those measures mean anything? If I were to move from a country with a low corruption score to a country with a high corruption score, how would that affect my daily life? Here's a really specific question. If I lost my wallet in a high corruption country, what are the chances that I actually get that wallet back? Well, we're gonna test this and we're gonna see if we can measure corruption by dropping 17,000 wallets in 40 different countries. Hi, I'm Craig and welcome to Market Power, where we believe in the power of markets and economics to shape our world. So if you want to join this community of people interested in and excited about economics, be sure to subscribe. But if we want to talk about an economic force that shapes our world, let's talk about corruption. Corruption can affect how we invest in our businesses. It can affect how we get education. It can affect our health. Measuring corruption can be really tough because people typically don't post these are the bribes that they're accepting right now. It also can be tough because you don't really want to talk about that corruption, and economists generally don't really trust what people say. They rely more on what people do. So is there a way to measure corruption in a country based on people's actions? Which brings me to wallets. Have you ever lost your wallet? Just last week, I'm leaving a store, walking to my car, and in the parking lot, I pull out my keys. I walk a few steps and suddenly I realize I do not have my wallet with me. I turn around and I see just a few steps back when I had pulled out my keys, my wallet had come with it and the wallet had fallen to the ground. And it was that terrifying moment where I realized I almost lost a lot of valuable items just through some silly circumstances. But a part of me also knows that if somebody had found that wallet, I'm pretty confident that they would have tried to find me and figure out how to get that wallet back to me. Which brings up a good way to test civic honesty. What if we were to give public servants wallets and say we found these wallets and ask them to try and find the person who owns it? An experiment like this has been run on YouTube before. Mark Rober dropped 200 wallets in the United States and Canada and tested to see which cities were most likely to return those wallets. The experiment I'm going to talk about differs in a few ways. First and foremost, there's just the scale. Mark Rober dropped 200 wallets. This is going to be 17,000 wallets, and it's going to be in 355 cities in 40 different countries. This is going to give us a lot of data to test. The second biggest difference is going to be in the experimental design. Mark Rober's test was just dropping wallets and seeing if people return them. We want to test for corruption. We want to test a specific thing, not just on people picking up wallets and returning them. We want to see if public servants are going to return the wallets. So we're going to go at this a little bit more specifically. We want to target important social institutions like a police station, a post office, or a movie theater. We want somebody to find a wallet, come up to the counter and say, hey, I found this wallet, and hand it to whoever's at the desk. Then say, somebody must have lost this. I'm in a hurry and have to go. Can you please take care of it? The responsibility is now on that servant to return that wallet. To help that servant, we're gonna put inside the wallet a contact card that has a unique email address for each wallet. And we're gonna see how many of these wallets actually have somebody try to return them. This is a pretty good test of corruption because we're giving these wallets to the type of people we expect to be involved in these systems. Well, how are we going to do this experiment? Well, unfortunately, I do not have millions of subscribers that I can enlist in this fun social experiment. Though, if you do subscribe, maybe we could do something like this in the future and I will welcome you into that project. Fortunately, there are some researchers who have already done this experiment for us. These researchers were looking for something different than what I'm talking about in corruption, but their results are so interesting, I want to take a minute and talk about what they found. Their main interest was looking at whether money in the wallet influenced whether people were going to return that wallet. Half of the wallets had no money in them at all, but the other half had about $13 in them. And then these were randomly distributed within the city, so that way there was no correlation with whether you received money in it and who you were. It was just totally random. Now remember, after dropping off this wallet, the researcher is going to run away. So there's no accountability for that specific civic servant. No one's gonna know whether that person returned the wallet or not, or at least that's that person's expectation. So this is the perfect opportunity to take a little bit of extra cash. Yet surprisingly, in 38 out of 40 countries, people were more likely to return the wallet if it had money in it. So one tip if you want to increase the chances of getting back a lost wallet is to keep just a little bit of cash in it at all times. Although wallets were more likely to be returned if they had cash in them, the probability of getting that wallet back differed by countries. In fact, we can look at the 5 most honest countries and the 5 least honest countries. The 5 most honest countries all had return rates greater than 70%. Number 5 was the Netherlands, number 4, Sweden, 3, Norway, 2, Denmark, and number 1 was Switzerland, which returned 76% of the wallets. And the 5 least honest countries all had return rates less than 18%. Number 5 was Morocco, 4, Kazakhstan, 3, Kenya, 2, China, and the least honest country was Peru, where less than 14% of the wallets were returned. It's also interesting to note that Peru was one of the 2 countries where having money in the wallet did not increase the chance of that wallet being returned. Let's look at these 2 groups of countries. If I had not already told you which one was the most honest and which one was the least honest, would you have been able to guess which group was the most honest and which group was the least honest just based on the countries within them? Sadly, I think so, because the most honest countries have pretty good reputations of good, honest governments, and the least honest countries are countries where we know they don't have the best governance. So already we're seeing there's evidence that this wallet experiment might tell us something about governance in that country. But we can do a more in-depth analysis by actually looking at the data. We're gonna take the return rates from this paper, and then we're gonna match them with some data from the World Bank. The World Bank has something called the World Governance Indicators, and these indicators are freely available. You can go download them yourself off the World Bank database, and they allow you to look at these corruption scores across countries. Before we look at the actual data, let's just try to predict what we're going to see. On the x-axis, let's have this as the control of corruption. So the further you are to the right, the more control that you have over corruption. That is, there's less corruption in your country. And the more you are to the left, the more corruption that you have in your government. And then on the y-axis, we're gonna have the return rates of the wallets. The higher up you go on this axis, the more wallets that are returned, and the lower, the more that people actually keep. If we were to do a scatter plot of these 2 variables, what's the pattern that we would expect? I think a pretty reasonable expectation is that in these countries where they have lower control of corruption or more corruption, we also expect to have fewer wallets returned. And then as we move to the right and we have more control over corruption, we have more wallets returned because there's less corruption in that country. This is a pretty easy, simple hypothesis, and it's something that we can examine just by plotting the data. So what do the data say? This is a pretty strong relationship. It fits exactly with the prediction that we made, and it has a statistically significant relationship. That means we can use one of these variables to predict the other one and come out with pretty high confidence that we're correct. So this is pretty amazing to me, and I mean, this is the kind of stuff that gets me excited when I see this stuff come out. Like, wow! This experiment actually shows us that these corruption scores mean something. Now, it's not perfect, right? We're seeing a lot of variation. In fact, there's one MVP that I want to point out, and that's this guy over here. This is one of the highest corruption scores. They have the least control over corruption, and yet they have a pretty high return of wallets in their country. Who do you think this country is? Surprisingly, this is Russia. Russia has a really high corruption score, but also has a lot of these wallets returned. Actually, the number of wallets is comparable to the United States. So even though these corruption scores do mean something in real life, they're not perfect. There's always room for error. Here at Market Power, we're always looking for these economic phenomena that just get us excited about the world. If that gets you excited, go ahead and check out these videos and make sure that you subscribe so that way you can be part of this community. We'll see you in the next Market Power.